Tiny Tina's Wonderlands came out just under 3 years ago now, and despite its relatively rocky release, the game did so many things right, despite also getting a few major things wrong. Almost exactly like another Gearbox game. Hey Vault Hunters, I'm Constant Canadian, and this is the good, the bad, and the ugly of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. If you enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel, and if you're looking for more Borderlands content, consider joining me live on YouTube. I live stream every Saturday through Tuesday from 6 PM EST until whenever I feel like it. I'll see you there. Starting off on the positive side with the character creator, which is honestly one of the better character creators I've ever used in my life. The amount of customization options in the character creation menu is insane, and while I don't normally start new playthroughs in the game nowadays, every time I do get the occasional itch to play Wonderlands again, I spend a solid 3 or 4 hours fine-tuning my character's looks. I will admit, when it was first announced that we would have a character creator in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, I was a little cynical, and I thought it would be the most bare-bones creator ever. But even still to this day, I'm amazed by the sheer number of different things we can customize about our character. We can change our gender, voice, hair color, skin color, face, shape, size, and features. And that's not even a small portion of the different things this game lets us do with our character. I especially like the overdrive feature that lets you do some really wacky things with your Fate Maker. Overall, the character creator in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is amazing and insanely expansive for what is only a very minor part of the game. Another big thing that Wonderlands did very well was its maps. I talked about maps and level design in my video about Borderlands 4's new trailer last week, but the maps in Borderlands 3 are honestly kinda trash. Every single Eden 6 map looks like every other Eden 6 map, every Promethea map looks like every other Promethea map, and the same goes for Pandora. The maps in Borderlands 3 were a huge step back from Borderlands 1 and 2. Luckily, in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, this is not the case. The maps in this game are very beautifully designed, chock full of fun things to discover, and more importantly, unique of one another. Every map has its own unique atmosphere and biosystems, and it makes exploring these multiple different maps actually fun, which is something that unfortunately cannot be said for Borderlands 3, at least not base game anyway. The more diverse and interesting maps was also helped significantly by the myriad of different collectibles like poems, marbles, lucky dice, scrolls, and the Cult of the Dragon Lord symbols, which actually gave us a pretty decent reason to want to explore these damn maps. The level design of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands was very well done, and some of my favorite maps from the Borderlands franchise are in this game, like Crackmast Cove, Karnock's Wall, and Tangle Drift. If you've watched me live at any point in the last 3 or 4 months, you've probably heard me complaining about the sheer number of different passives that various class mods and artifacts can roll with in Borderlands 3. If you haven't, you really should, it's fun. But regardless, there are 69 different passives that a class mod can roll with and 39 that artifacts can roll with. This makes getting one specific passive super rare, and getting 2 or 3 specific passives damn near impossible. A 1 in 300,000 for class mods and a 1 in 54,000 for artifacts. It's one thing that specific passives are so rare, but even worse is that so many of the passives available are either useless or just way too specific to be a good option in 99% of situations. But what does this have to do with Tiny Tina's Wonderlands? Well, in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, armor only has 19 separate passive secondary stats that it can roll with, and Amulet and Rings only have 28 secondary passives they can roll with, though they function much differently drop-wise than artifacts from 3. All of this is just a long-winded way to say, the passive situation in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is a lot more tolerable than it was in Borderlands 3, and farming for armor, rings, and amulets doesn't feel anywhere near as awful as it does in Borderlands 3. Honestly, the way that armor, rings, and amulets work in terms of primary and secondary passive rolls is just leagues better than it is in Borderlands 3 in my opinion. Another thing that Tiny Tina's Wonderlands did very well in my opinion was its implementation of various D&D themed mechanics. Melee weapons, despite my initial skepticism, were pretty well thought out and balanced. The spells from this game felt very fun to use and had a whole bunch of extra variation, most of which felt pretty strong, even if a few legendary spells were kinda gimmicky. The spells in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, especially the non-unique ones, felt so good that I honestly didn't even miss grenades while playing it, like I thought I would. Then there's also the hero point system and the character background system, which provide minor but noticeable bonuses to your character. All of these things, combined with the crit chance mechanic, were very well implemented, which really sets Wonderlands apart from any other Borderlands game in a good way. Now, I'm not saying these features would necessarily be welcome in a mainline Borderlands title, but they fit in very nicely in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands and any potential sequels it may have. The balance of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands also felt pretty damn solid too. None of the classes felt too underpowered, even if some were obviously a little worse off than others, and in the same vein, none of them felt too overpowered either. Additionally, the weapons felt strong too, the legendaries for the most part felt strong and unique, but more importantly, the purple non-uniques weren't completely worthless in comparison, which cannot be said about most of the non-uniques in Borderlands 3. Despite having an obscene amount of endgame levels, the final balance of the game at Chaos level 100 didn't feel overly unfair or unbalanced or anything along those lines, which is a really impressive feat for Gearbox nowadays. Something that really helped keep balance in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands was the lack of artificial HP and damage inflation. This is something that has been very prevalent in both Borderlands 2 and 3, where, as time went on, the amount of health that enemies had just kept going up and up and up, resulting in some massive enemy health bars, and as such, our damage output had to keep going up and up and up. At the end of the day, this realistically just results in numbers being bigger without actually meaning anything. It's similar to cutting a pizza into less slices so you can say you eat less pizza. It doesn't matter how many slices you cut the pizza into, 2, 4, 12, 32, if you ate 50% of the pizza, you ate 50% of the pizza. Now, that might not be the best analogy, but I think it gets the point across. The only thing that artificially increasing enemy health values does is leave far more opportunities for things to lag behind in terms of damage, which is a very large part of why so many different weapons in Borderlands 3 feel borderline useless. Because as enemy health values kept going up and up and up, there was only so much that could be done for the 300 plus different weapons in the game. And while Gearbox buffed what they could, there's still a lot of weapons that either didn't receive any buffs or received tiny buffs that didn't actually change anything. This artificial inflation of damage numbers does not exist to the same degree in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, and it really shows in just how many different items are actually decent in endgame play. Mainline story bosses in Wonderlands at level 40 Chaos 100 have anywhere from 50 to 150 million health, whereas in Borderlands 3 they've got upwards of 1 billion health. All artificially inflating damage numbers does, especially post-launch, is make the game way harder to balance, and I'm really glad that Tiny Tina's Wonderlands managed to avoid doing that for the most part, as it really left the game feeling very well balanced by the end of its development cycle. Raid bosses are a pretty big part of the Borderlands franchise at this point. Each game that comes out is expected to come out with a raid boss. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands was no exception to the rule, and released with 4 separate raid bosses for us to fight. And despite them being locked all to the same activity, which we will talk about later, they all felt really fun to fight. Their mechanics were pretty fun to fight around, and at no point during fighting these raid bosses did I actually feel like I was just shooting at something until it died. It was also an especially nice touch that the puzzles to unlock the raid boss fights hinted at their mechanics, so you weren't going in completely clueless. A lot of the raid bosses in Borderlands are simply souped up, tankier versions of other enemies in the game with an additional attack or two, which is fine, but I really enjoyed having additional mechanics in the raid boss fights from Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. The final good we have for Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is the writing, which I know is fully subjective, but I feel that the main story of this game was very well written, as well as the side quests. The main story of this game does a great job of taking itself somewhat seriously while also remembering to be a lighthearted, goofy story of fantasy and fiction. You may disagree with me, and that's fine, but in my opinion, the characters and quests from this game are very well written. If you watched my The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly on Borderlands the pre-sequel, then you'll know that that game launched with very few respawning bosses and next to no dedicated drop sources for various items in that game. You'd also know that 2K Australia eventually got around to fixing that huge issue that was almost a complete step back from the game before it. While I'm sure you can see where this is going, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands also initially launched with very few respawning enemies and bosses, as well as very few dedicated drop sources in the game. It wasn't as bad as release pre-sequel was, as at least the main story bosses in Wonderlands respawn, but there is still so many unique named enemies that do not respawn outside of the Chaos Chambers. And unlike the pre-sequel, this was never changed with a patch or fix or anything. That means that to this day, there are 156 legendary items that can drop, only 83 of which have dedicated respawning sources. meaning that there are 73 different legendaries that have no drop source aside from hoping for a world drop or playing through the Chaos Chambers. 47% of the legendary items in this game don't have drop sources for whatever reason. And it's not even like there weren't enough unique sources to give these drops to, but so few unique sources actually respawn for whatever reason. I'm not sure what Gearbox's obsession with world drop farming is, but this is the third game in a row to launch with so few respawnable sources and dedicated drops. And unfortunately for Wonderlands, it's also the only game that never got that problem fixed, making farming for 47% of the items in this game an absolute nightmare. Somewhere that I felt this game actually fell kinda short was in the amount of classes we got. The introduction of the multi-class system was a cool addition to the game, and while we did in the end get 7 different classes that we could mix and match, I think it would have been really cool to get a few more, or maybe even an extra skill tree for each class so farming odds don't get inflated. The classes we did get were super cool, and each one felt super unique and fun to use, which is great, but I would have really loved to see some other classes get added to the mix to give us even more variety in our builds. It would have been super awesome to get a class dedicated to explosions or something along those lines. I'm not unhappy with the selection we did get, I just wish we got a little bit more. The Overworld was one of the strangest things going from Borderlands 1, 2, the pre-sequel, and 3 to this game. Rather than wasting space on big maps for no reason just to give us places to drive a car, we got the Overworld, where we just walked across a game board to our destination. Now, there were a couple of things that I liked about the Overworld. The hidden collectibles, challenges, and whatnot were cool, but the overall Overworld board was just kind of a snooze fest. The dungeons were okay, despite having one problem we'll get into soon, but most of the time they felt rather uninspired and boring. The most annoying part about the Overworld map for me though, was the random encounters that would seemingly come out of nowhere, and sure, you could avoid the large majority of them, but sometimes they'd spawn right in front of where you actually need to go, and they're not skippable, so you just have to deal with them. These Overworld encounters were just very boring for me, and really dragged out the basic exploration or quests I went there to do. It's especially funny considering how insanely well designed the maps in this game are. This is a game that I realistically don't mind getting lost in, as the maps are so damn beautiful, and yet I'm forced to go to the Overworld and leave these beautifully designed maps to travel from one zone to another. Another big contributing factor to the boringness of the random encounters was the lack of enemy density. There is a lot of mobbing in this game, whether it be through chaos chambers, random encounters, dungeons, campsites, and you would expect that for a game with so much mobbing, the mobbing would feel good. However, the extreme lack of enemy density makes mobbing feel super underwhelming. If you didn't know what I'm talking about, enemy density is basically how many enemies spawn at one time in the area around the player. So when I say that enemy density is too low, I'm basically just saying that there is either way too much time in between spawn waves, or there is just not enough enemies in each wave to begin with. Take the Chaos Chambers for example. They're called the Chaos Chambers, you would expect them to be, well, chaotic. But the average room in the Chaos Chambers for me usually goes like this. Kill the first few enemies, spend 10 seconds looking for the next enemy and kill them, and then repeat that over and over until the final enemy is dead. Not very chaotic at all. Gearbox actually put out a fix to this about 2 years back, but even still, the rate that the enemies spawn at is just too low. And it's even worse when you're fighting the crabs, as they like to burrow underneath stuff and make themselves even more hidden and, more importantly, stationary. This isn't a problem in the regular maps of the game or even the obelisk areas, but every time I do chaos chambers or dungeons in the overworld, I spend more time looking for the enemies than I do actually killing the enemies. There are a few really huge things that set this game back significantly. The first of which is the loot luck system. Let me be clear here. The loot luck system changing the rate of which legendaries drop through world drops was huge. It let players who didn't like getting showered with legendary gear choose to avoid that so they could thoroughly enjoy this new title, while allowing people who want lots of legendaries to get them. Where the loot luck system becomes ugly though, is when Gearbox decided to also tie this new loot luck system to the dedicated drop rates as well. Which means that the people who do enjoy dedicated drop farming over world drop farming now have to inadvertently increase their world drops to get the maximum chance for their dedicated drops. The difference in dedicated drop chance isn't small either. With a base loot luck at level 40 of 1,640 or so, and a maximum of 8,340 at Chaos 0, your drop chances are significantly limited as a new player who just reached max level, even after collecting all the loot dice and doing the shrine for loot luck. If we compare that to our maximum loot luck at Chaos 100 with myth rank maxed out, no luck modifying gear of 83,000 or so, a new player just starting out will have a drop chance of around 11% at max level, which is fine until you consider the insane amount of variation in the gear. But that's with all the loot dice. If said player didn't really understand the mechanic fully and didn't grab any loot dice or luck modifiers as they didn't want a lot of world drops, then they would have a dedicated drop chance of around 8%, which is incredibly small. Compared now to the maximum without gear boosts of around 83,000, and you're sitting at around a 20% chance for a legendary dedicated drop, which is an insanely staggering difference at the end of the day. And don't even bother trying to dedicated drop farm before reaching max levels, as at lower levels from 1 to 20, dedicated drops are around 2 to 5% without modifiers. Let me just say, thank the Dragon Lord, we only have to find these things once per save now, instead of every single character like we used to have to. Loot luck could have been a great addition to Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, and could have realistically solved one of the biggest debates of modern Borderlands games, until Gearbox made the completely asinine decision to tie it to dedicated drops as well. Another very obvious issue when you finally do reach the endgame is that there's literally zero endgame outside of the Chaos Chambers. Borderlands games are about 20% story and 80% farming and endgame. Borderlands 2 and 3 had so many different things to do in their respective endgames, with multiple DLCs, raid bosses, slaughter shafts, and additionally in Borderlands 3, trials and takedowns. The huge variety of endgame activities is why this game has such a huge cult following. There's almost always some form of endgame content for everybody, whether it's theory crafting, story resets, raid bosses, slaughter shafts, or trials. The lack of endgame content is a huge part of why the pre-sequel, despite being an amazing game, didn't get anywhere near as much playtime as the other two overall. So naturally, you'd think that Gearbox would learn from that mistake and make absolute certain that their future titles end up with loads of endgame content. It eventually got there with Borderlands 3, despite being fairly light at launch, but with Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, Gearbox went full tunnel vision on the new Chaos Chambers, locking every single piece of endgame content behind this new addition. You want to do an endgame mobbing area? Go to the Chaos Chambers. You want to fight 4 amazing raid bosses? You gotta go to the Chaos Chambers. Even a large majority of farming eventually boils down to running Chaos Chambers and hitting up the bunnies for world drops. The endgame of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is literally running 60 Chaos Trials to get to Chaos 100, and after painstakingly farming up the levels and gear required of that difficulty, you're rewarded with more Chaos Chambers. This is a huge part of the reason that I can't even bring myself to start a new character in this game anymore, as I know all that's waiting for me after beating the game and reaching max level is the same run over and over and over and over again. Now, Gearbox did eventually add in a boss rush mode, which added a little bit of variety, but at the end of the day, it's just more Chaos Chambers. Also, while we're talking about Chaos Chambers, why the hell are there 100 Chaos levels? That is by far the craziest decision in this game to me. No other Borderlands game has gone anywhere near 25, let alone 100 endgame levels. Each Chaos level is such a minor increase too, and there could have realistically been 10 levels that granted 10 times the bonuses that they currently do. It was already bad enough when Chaos 50 was the maximum, but when they upped it to Chaos 100, I damn near cried. It would be very hard to talk about the ugly of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands without talking about the game's 4 DLCs, if you want to call them that. The DLC for this game is $13.50 Canadian, meaning that if you buy all 4 DLCs separately, you're paying upwards of 50 Canadian dollars for them. Seems like a pretty decent deal considering that Borderlands 3's first 4 DLCs were $20 a piece. That is until you consider the amount of content in these $13 DLCs for Tiny Tina's Wonderlands have about as much content in them as Borderlands 2's $5 Headhunter packs, and as much content in them as Borderlands 3's free content. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands DLCs, otherwise known as Mirrors of Mysteries, unlocked an additional area in the game known as Dreamvale Overlook that honestly looks pretty damn amazing. In this area, there are 4 mirrors that bring you to a repeatable dungeon with 4 levels, each level increasing in difficulty. Each of these repeatable dungeons have a few rooms with a challenge in each room, and then a boss fight at the end with a couple of new pieces of loot being added to their loot pool. So essentially, the DLC for this game is 4 more glorified Chaos Chambers with a few new items. Now thankfully, the 4th DLC did include a new class, the Blightcaller, but aside from that, that was all the DLCs had to offer. This might be a little far-fetched, but I was genuinely hoping that after beating level 4 of all of the dungeons, Vesper, the main NPC in all of these DLCs, would turn out to be some evil entity and then the real DLC would start, but that never happened. Borderlands as a series has never really missed in terms of DLCs. In fact, some of its best content was its DLCs. But Wonderlands really dropped the ball hard for DLCs, and it hurt the overall respect of not only the game, but Gearbox as a whole. The last point I want to talk about today is once again tied to the drops in this game. Longtime fans of the franchise will know how horrible it felt to spend hours upon hours farming for dedicated drops in Borderlands 2 in the pre-sequel, just to finally get that perfect roll and find out it's actually 2 levels lower than your current level, and worse than the one you've already got. There are very few things more annoying in this franchise than farming for hours for the perfect god roll just to have it be super underleveled. That's one of the greatest changes that Borderlands 3 made to farming. All the gear that dropped would be on level with your character, which is why it hurts so much for Gearbox to take yet another step backwards with Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. In this game, there are 4 different tiers of gear that you can get from Chaos levels: Chaotic, Volatile, Primordial, and Ascended. This gear essentially just gets a slight boost of about 14 to 20% to its damage for weapons and passive stats for armor, amulets, and rings. The problem lies with the fact that yet again, getting the correct roll for your gear is percentage based, meaning that you can once again get underleveled gear when farming. Now at Chaos level 100, there is a 0% chance for Chaotic and Volatile, the lower of the 2 tiers, but there's a 51% chance for the best, Ascended, and a 49% chance for the one lower than it, Primordial. So essentially there's a 50% chance that your gear drops underleveled. The odds of your gear dropping underleveled only gets lower as you go lower in Chaos levels. So farming for anything is once again made to be potentially enraging by this extra layer of RNG that was added for seemingly no reason. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands honestly had an amazing base game experience, great writing, and amazing balance, but it absolutely fell apart when Gearbox tunnel visioned on Chaos Chambers and world drop farming. Thank you all so much for watching, have a fantastic day.